Sometimes heroes aren't found in wrestling rings or on television screens. Sometimes they're small children with big courage, who know that even the scariest secrets need to be told. When WWE superstar Paul "Big Show" White stopped at an Atlanta McDonald's for a quiet lunch, he never expected to meet a tiny warrior who would change his life forever. A little boy in a worn blue t-shirt, watching from across the restaurant with serious eyes, holding a secret that would make even the world's largest athlete turn pale. What could a 5-year-old possibly whisper that would make a 7-foot giant reach for his phone and dial 911? The answer would start a chain of events that would save not just one life, but many others to come. This is the story of Tommy, Sarah, and the day a whispered secret changed everything. Paul White, better known to wrestling fans as the Big Show, just wanted to eat his lunch in peace. It wasn't easy being 7 feet tall and famous. The McDonald's in downtown Atlanta was busy that Tuesday afternoon, and he could already hear the whispers starting. "Look how big he is. Is that really him? Should we ask for a picture?" Paul smiled politely at the people staring his way. He was used to it. When you're a giant who appears on TV wrestling shows, people tend to notice you. He picked up his Big Mac, which looked tiny in his massive hands, and tried to focus on eating. The restaurant smelled like French fries and coffee. The lunch crowd filled most of the red plastic booths, and the sound of kids playing in the play place echoed through the building. Paul had chosen a corner spot where he could stretch out his long legs without blocking the aisle. A group of teenage boys kept glancing his way, nudging each other and working up the courage to come over. Paul knew the drill. They'd want photos and autographs, maybe ask about his famous knockout punch move. He didn't mind, really. Making fans happy was part of his job. But sometimes he just wanted to eat his burger like a regular person. That's when he first noticed the little boy. Unlike the other kids who pointed and stared openly, this boy was different. He stood near the drink machines, a small figure in a worn blue t-shirt that seemed a size too big. He looked about 5 years old, with messy brown hair and eyes that seemed too serious for such a young face. The boy wasn't playing or running around like the other children. He wasn't asking his parents for toys or extra fries. In fact, Paul realized he didn't seem to be with any grown-ups at all. The boy just stood there, watching Paul with an intensity that made the big wrestler feel uneasy. Paul tried to distract himself by checking his phone, but he could still feel those eyes on him. When he looked up again, the boy had moved a little closer, now standing near an empty table a few feet away. Their eyes met for a moment before the boy quickly looked down at his feet. Something wasn't right. Paul had met thousands of young fans over the years, and this felt different. Most kids would either run up excitedly or hide behind their parents. This boy seemed scared, but not of Paul's size. It was something else. The teenager group finally gathered their courage and approached Paul's table. "Hey, Big Show, could we get a picture?" the tallest boy asked, already holding up his phone. "Sure thing, guys," Paul said with a friendly smile. He stood up, towering over the teens who gasped at his full height. As they crowded around him for the photo, Paul noticed the little boy had moved even closer. After signing a few napkins for the teenagers and answering questions about his next wrestling match, Paul sat back down. His food was getting cold, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He watched as the small boy picked up an empty cup from a nearby table and walked to the drink machine but didn't fill it. He just stood there, stealing glances at Paul. The restaurant manager, a woman with a kind face and a name tag that read Maria, seemed to notice the boy too. She walked over to him and asked, "Are you okay, sweetie? Are you here with someone?" The boy nodded quickly, but didn't say anything. Maria looked around the restaurant with concern, then got called away to help at the registers. The boy put down the empty cup and moved closer to Paul's table. A noisy group of office workers came in, momentarily blocking Paul's view. When they moved past, the boy had disappeared. Paul felt a mix of relief and worry. Maybe the boy had found his parents. Maybe everything was fine. Then he felt a small tap on his arm. Paul turned to find the boy standing right next to him, those serious eyes now filled with tears. The boy's hands were trembling, and Paul could see a small bruise near his collar that had been hidden before. "Hey there, buddy," Paul said softly, trying to sound as gentle as a giant could. "What's your name?" The boy glanced around nervously, as if checking to make sure no one was watching. Then he leaned in close to Paul's chair. Paul had to bend down to hear him, the boy's voice barely a whisper. What the child said next would change everything. But for now, he was just a scared little boy, gathering all his courage to speak to the biggest person he'd ever seen, hoping that being big meant being able to help. The lunch crowd chattered on. The play place echoed with laughter. The smell of fries filled the air. And in a corner of an Atlanta McDonald's, a tiny warrior prepared to tell his secret to a gentle giant. The boy's lips trembled as he leaned in close to Paul's ear. His small body shook like a leaf in the wind, and Paul could smell the clean scent of children's shampoo mixed with something else. Fear. "My name is Tommy," the boy whispered, his voice so quiet Paul had to strain to hear it. "I saw you on TV. You help people who are in trouble." Paul nodded slowly, careful not to make any sudden moves that might scare Tommy away. "That's right, buddy. I try to help when I can." Tommy glanced over his shoulder again, checking the door. When he turned back, a tear rolled down his cheek. He stood on his tiptoes to reach Paul's ear again, and what he whispered next made the big man's blood run cold. The words hit Paul like a physical blow. His face went pale, and his massive hands gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned white. In all his years of wrestling, of playing the tough guy, of being the largest athlete in the room, nothing had ever made him feel so helpless as those few whispered words from a 5-year-old boy. "Stay right here with me, okay, Tommy?" Paul said, keeping his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. "Would you like some chicken nuggets?" Tommy's eyes widened at the mention of food, and he nodded quickly. Paul waved over Maria, the manager, trying to keep his face calm, even though his heart was racing. "Could we get a Happy Meal for my friend Tommy here?" Paul asked, pulling out his wallet. He could see Maria looking at Tommy with concern, noticing his worn clothes and nervous behavior. "Of course," she said, her eyes meeting Paul's. She could tell something was wrong. "Would you like apple slices with that, sweetie?" Tommy nodded again, but stayed pressed close to Paul's side, as if afraid to move away. While Maria went to get the food, Paul pulled out his phone. His hands were shaking slightly, something that hadn't happened since his first wrestling match years ago. "Tommy," Paul said gently, "I need to make a quick phone call, but I'm not going anywhere. I'll stay right here with you. Is that okay?" Another small nod. Paul dialed 911, keeping the phone low and partially hidden by the table. When the operator answered, he spoke quietly, but clearly. "Hello, this is Paul White. I'm at the McDonald's on Pine Street in downtown Atlanta. I need officers here right away, but please, no sirens." He glanced down at Tommy, who was watching a family with 2 happy kids walk past their table. "I have a young boy here who needs help. The situation is delicate." The operator asked a few questions, which Paul answered while trying to sound casual, as if he was just ordering more food. Tommy didn't need to be any more scared than he already was. Maria returned with the Happy Meal, setting it down carefully in front of Tommy. "Here you go, sweetie. Would you like some extra ketchup?" Tommy looked up at Paul, asking permission with his eyes. When Paul nodded encouragingly, Tommy spoke for the first time above a whisper. "Yes, please." His voice was small and scratchy, like he hadn't used it much lately. Maria brought back several packets of ketchup, along with extra napkins and a couple of cookies she slipped in with a wink. Paul watched as Tommy carefully opened the Happy Meal box, his small hands treating it like treasure. The boy's movements were cautious, as if he was afraid someone might take the food away at any moment. Through the restaurant's windows, Paul saw a police car pull up quietly. No lights or sirens. Two officers, a man and a woman, walked in casually, like they were just getting lunch. They headed for the counter, but Paul could tell they were scanning the restaurant, looking for him. Tommy was halfway through his first chicken nugget when he spotted the police. His whole body went rigid with fear, and he dropped the food back into the box. "It's okay," Paul said softly, placing one giant hand gently on Tommy's shoulder. "Remember what you told me? You're being really brave, Tommy. Really brave. These people are here to help, just like you asked me to." Tears started flowing down Tommy's face again, but he didn't run. He stayed right next to Paul, his small body trembling but holding its ground. In that moment, Paul realized that this tiny boy might be the strongest person he'd ever met. The officers approached slowly, the woman taking the lead while her partner stayed back. They'd done this before. They knew how to handle scared kids. But they didn't know what Paul knew. They hadn't heard Tommy's whispered secret, the one that had turned the mighty Big Show pale with anger and fear. That secret would have to wait just a little longer, while these professionals did their job. But Paul made a silent promise to Tommy right then. This boy's bravery wouldn't be wasted. Whatever happened next, the giant would make sure of that. The female officer knelt down beside Tommy's chair, keeping enough distance not to frighten him. Her name tag read Officer Chen, and her smile was gentle. "Hi there," she said softly. "I'm Sarah. That's a pretty cool Happy Meal toy you've got there." Tommy clutched the small plastic figure tighter but didn't speak. His shoulder pressed harder against Paul's arm, seeking safety in the giant's presence. Paul remembered being scared like that once, long ago. He'd been a kid in South Carolina, not much older than Tommy, when he'd needed help, too. Back then, it had been his school teacher who noticed something was wrong. Now, 30 years later, he was on the other side of that moment. "Tommy," Paul said carefully, "Officer Sarah is really nice. Remember how you were brave enough to talk to me? You can be brave with her, too." The boy looked up at Paul with those serious eyes, searching for reassurance. Paul nodded encouragingly, while his mind raced back to his phone call with the 911 operator. They'd told him to keep Tommy calm and in one place until help arrived. So far, he was doing that. Maria, the restaurant manager, was helping too. She'd quietly asked other customers to move to different sections, giving them space. Now she stood near the counter, keeping watch to make sure nobody interrupted. Officer Chen's partner, a tall man with kind eyes, spoke quietly into his radio, calling for someone named Ms. Parker from Child Services to come right away. Paul noticed he was careful to stay back, letting his female partner take the lead. "Tommy," Officer Chen said, still keeping her voice soft and friendly, "would you like to keep sitting here with Mr. Paul while we talk? You're not in any trouble. We just want to make sure you're okay." A small nod from Tommy. He hadn't touched his food since the police arrived. but his grip on the toy hadn't loosened. Paul felt a familiar ache in his chest, the same one he'd felt when Tommy first whispered his secret. It reminded him of another time, another place, when he'd seen a kid wearing long sleeves on a hot day, just like Tommy was now. "You're doing great, buddy," Paul encouraged. "Just like a superhero." That got a tiny smile from Tommy, the first one Paul had seen. It disappeared quickly, but it was there. Officer Chen noticed it too. "Do you like superheroes, Tommy? Who's your favorite?" Tommy glanced up at Paul before whispering, "The Big Show. He helps people." Paul felt his throat tighten. All those years in the wrestling ring, playing both hero and villain, and here was this little boy who had seen something else in him, someone who could help. The restaurant door chimed as a woman in a neat blue suit walked in. She carried a small briefcase and had a warm, grandmother-like face. Officer Chen seemed to recognize her. "Tommy, this is Ms. Parker," she said. "She helps kids who need special help." Ms. Parker stayed by the counter, talking quietly with Officer Chen's partner. Paul could see they were developing a plan, being careful not to overwhelm Tommy. That's when Tommy started to cry. It wasn't loud sobbing, just silent tears rolling down his cheeks. His small body shook, and the toy finally slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the table. Paul did what felt natural. He turned in his chair and used his massive frame to shield Tommy from the rest of the restaurant. "It's okay, buddy," he said softly. "You don't have to be brave all by yourself anymore." The words triggered something in Paul's memory. Words someone had said to him long ago, when he was the scared kid. He hadn't understood then how much courage it took for a child to speak up. Now, looking at Tommy, he understood perfectly. Sewers. Parker approached slowly, carrying something fuzzy and brown. As she got closer, Paul could see it was a teddy bear wearing a tiny police uniform. "Tommy," she said, her voice warm and gentle. "This is Officer Fuzzy. He helps kids tell their stories when it's hard to talk. Would you like to hold him?" Tommy looked at the bear, then up at Paul again. When Paul nodded, Tommy reached out with trembling hands and took the bear. He hugged it close, burying his face in its soft fur. Officer Chen moved her chair a little closer. "Tommy, can you tell Officer Fuzzy what you told Mr. Paul? We want to help, but we need to know what's wrong." Paul held his breath. This was the moment. The secret would finally come out. He watched Tommy squeeze the teddy bear tighter, gathering his courage once again. The lunch crowd had thinned out now. The play place was quiet. Even the kitchen sounds seemed muted, as if the whole restaurant was holding its breath with Paul, waiting to hear what this brave little boy would say next. Tommy hugged Officer Fuzzy closer, his small fingers gripping the teddy bear's police uniform. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely louder than before, but in the quiet restaurant, everyone could hear him. "I haven't eaten since Sunday," he whispered to the bear. "They lock the food away. They say I'm bad." Paul felt his massive hands curl into fists under the table. He forced them to relax, remembering that Tommy needed him to be calm right now. "Officer." Chen wrote something in her small notebook, her face professional but her eyes sad. "Who locks the food away, Tommy?" "The people who are supposed to take care of me," Tommy said into the bear's fur. "But they don't. They're mean to her, too." Ms. Parker leaned forward slightly. "Who are they mean to, sweetheart?" But Tommy shook his head, pressing his face deeper into Officer Fuzzy's soft brown fur. Paul could see the boy trembling again, and he remembered the secret Tommy had first whispered to him. the one that had made his blood run cold. "It's okay, buddy," Paul said gently. "Remember how brave you were when you came to talk to me? You can be brave again. These people want to help, just like I do." Tommy peeked out from behind the teddy bear, looking up at Paul with trust in his tear-filled eyes. "You promise they won't get mad?" "I promise," Paul said firmly. "No one here will let anyone hurt you ever again." Maria, the restaurant manager, had brought over a glass of water and some extra napkins. She placed them quietly on the table, then stepped back, her own eyes glistening with tears. Officer Chen's partner spoke quietly into his radio again, and Paul could hear him requesting additional officers to stand by. Whatever Tommy was about to reveal, they were getting ready to act. "Tommy," Ms. Parker said softly, "when was the last time you saw a doctor or went to school?" Tommy shrugged his small shoulders. "I don't go to school. They say I'm too stupid. My stomach hurts a lot. And my head, too, sometimes." Paul thought about all the injuries he'd suffered in the wrestling ring over the years, the broken bones, the bruises, the concussions. But those had been his choice, part of his job. What Tommy was describing was something entirely different, something no child should ever experience. "Can you tell Officer Fuzzy about where you live?" Officer Chen asked. "What's your house like?" Tommy's voice got even quieter. "It's dark. They keep the windows covered. There's lots of scary noises at night, and smells that make me feel sick." He paused, clutching the bear tighter. "Sometimes people come over, and we have to stay in the small room. If we make noise, we don't get food." "We?" Ms. Parker asked carefully. "Who stays in the room with you, Tommy?" But Tommy started crying again, his whole body shaking. Paul wished he could just scoop the boy up and carry him away from whatever nightmare he'd been living in. But he knew they had to do this right, had to let the professionals handle it properly. Officer Chen's partner was already heading for the door, speaking rapidly but quietly into his radio. Paul knew what was happening. They were getting ready to move in, to find this house Tommy was describing. Ms. Parker opened her briefcase and took out some papers. "Tommy, you're being so brave. Dr. Sarah is going to meet us at a special place where we can make sure you're healthy. Would you like Mr. Paul to come with us?" Tommy nodded quickly, his grip on Paul's arm tightening. Paul looked at Officer Chen, who gave a slight nod of approval. "I'll stay with you, buddy," Paul promised, "as long as you need me to." That's when Tommy said something that broke everyone's heart. "I haven't had a bed in a long time, just the floor. It's cold." Maria couldn't hold back her tears anymore. She turned away, wiping her eyes with her apron. Even Officer Chen had to take a deep breath before continuing. "Tommy," Ms. Parker said, her voice still gentle but firm, "we're going to make sure you have a warm bed tonight, and food whenever you're hungry. But we need to know one more thing. Is there anyone else at that house who needs our help?" Tommy looked up at Paul again, his eyes full of fear and hope mixed together. Paul nodded encouragingly, and Tommy turned to Ms. Parker. "My sister," he whispered, and then added something that made everyone in earshot freeze. "But I don't know if she's still there. She wasn't moving this morning." The response was immediate but controlled. Officer Chen's partner burst back through the door, nodding to his colleague. More police cars were quietly pulling up outside, their lights off to avoid causing a scene. "Tommy," Paul said, trying to keep his voice steady, "you did the right thing coming to talk to me. You're the bravest person I've ever met, and I know a lot of wrestlers." That got another tiny smile from Tommy, even through his tears. Except Parker was already gathering her things, preparing to transport Tommy to a safe place. Officer Chen had stood up, ready to join her fellow officers. "Mr. Paul?" Tommy's voice was small but clearer now. Will you make sure they find her? Please?" Paul looked into those serious eyes, remembering the secret Tommy had first whispered to him, the words that had started all of this. He made another silent promise, this one even more important than the first. "They'll find her, buddy, and she'll be safe too, just like you're going to be." As they prepared to leave the restaurant, Paul realized that his cold burger and fries were still sitting on the table, forgotten hours ago. Sometimes, he thought, a missed lunch could change everything. The police cars moved silently through the streets of Atlanta, following Tommy's directions. Paul sat in the back of a police SUV with Tommy and Ms. Parker, the boy still clutching Officer Fuzzy tightly. They had wrapped him in a soft blanket that Ms. Parker kept in her car for cases like this. "It's the greenhouse," Tommy whispered, as they turned onto a quiet street. "With the broken mailbox?" Paul looked out the window at the house Tommy pointed to. From the outside, it looked ordinary enough, a small greenhouse with peeling paint and overgrown grass, but Paul knew that ordinary-looking places could hide terrible secrets. Officer Chen's partner, who had introduced himself as Officer Rodriguez, spoke quietly into his radio. Within moments, more police cars appeared from different directions, parking quietly along the street. "Tommy," Ms. Parker said gently, "you're going to stay here with Mr. Paul while the police check the house. Is that okay?" Tommy nodded, pressing closer to Paul's side. Through the SUV's windows, they watched as officers approached the house carefully, some going around to the back. Paul felt Tommy start trembling again when a beat-up truck pulled into the driveway of the house. A man and woman got out, looking confused at all the police cars. Paul recognized the moment they realized what was happening. Their faces changed from confusion to anger to fear in seconds. Officer Chen stepped forward to talk to them, her hand resting carefully on her belt. Tommy buried his face in Paul's side, not wanting to watch. "It's okay, buddy," Paul said softly. "They can't hurt anyone anymore." Ms. Parker was watching everything carefully, taking notes in a small notebook. When another car pulled up, she smiled slightly. "That's Dr. Sarah," she explained to Tommy. "She's going to help us make sure your sister is okay." The next few minutes seemed to move both very fast and very slow. The man and woman were put in handcuffs, reading their rights, by Officer Rodriguez. Other officers entered the house, their faces grim. Then came a shout from inside. "We need medical in here now!" Dr. Sarah rushed into the house with her medical bag. Paul felt Tommy's small hand grip his arm tighter. "She was cold this morning," Tommy whispered. "I tried to wake her up, but she wouldn't move. That's when I ran away to find help." Paul fought back tears of his own. This little boy had been so brave, running to find someone who could help when his sister needed him most. Minutes that felt like hours passed. Finally, Dr. Sarah emerged from the house with a small bundle in her arms, a little girl, even smaller than Tommy, wrapped in emergency blankets. Behind her, paramedics rushed up with a stretcher. "She's alive," Ms. Parker said quickly, seeing the fear on Tommy's face. "They're going to take very good care of her." Tommy started crying again, but these tears seemed different. Paul recognized them as tears of relief. As they watched, more police cars arrived. Officers began carrying out evidence in bags and boxes. Paul noticed they were wearing masks and gloves. Whatever was inside that house, it was bad. A detective came to their car to talk to Ms. Parker. Paul couldn't hear everything they said, but he caught phrases like drug house and other children and trafficking investigation. He was glad Tommy seemed too tired to listen. "Tommy," Ms. Parker said after the detective left, "your sister is going to the hospital. but she's going to be okay. Would you like to go see her?" Tommy nodded eagerly, then looked up at Paul with worried eyes. "Will you come too?" "Of course, buddy," Paul answered without hesitation. His schedule, his plans, his life, everything else could wait. Right now, this was where he needed to be. As they drove to the hospital, Paul's phone started buzzing with messages. News was getting out. A famous wrestler involved in rescuing children from a drug house. It was the kind of story that spread fast. But Paul didn't care about any of that. He was thinking about Tommy's sister, about other children who might be out there needing help, about all the times people looked away because it was easier than getting involved. At the hospital, they were met by more police officers and social workers. News came quickly about Tommy's sister. She was dehydrated and malnourished, but she would recover. She had been unconscious, but not as bad as Tommy had feared. "You saved her life," Ms. Parker told Tommy as they sat in the bright hospital waiting room. "By being brave and asking for help, you saved your sister." Tommy looked up at her with those serious eyes. "Will we have to go back?" "No, sweetheart," Ms. Parker said firmly. "Never. We're going to find you and your sister a new home, with people who will take good care of you." Paul watched as Tommy processed this information, his small face showing a mix of hope and uncertainty. The boy was exhausted, slumping against Paul's arm as the events of the day caught up with him. As Tommy finally drifted off to sleep, still holding Officer Fuzzy, Paul made another decision. This wasn't going to be the end of his involvement. He had a platform, a voice people listened to. He could make sure stories like Tommy's were heard. More importantly, he could make sure other children knew there were people who would help them, even giant wrestlers in McDonald's restaurants. Outside, the hospital window, the Atlanta sun was setting. In a bed upstairs, a little girl was getting the care she desperately needed. And here, in this waiting room, a brave little boy slept safely for the first time in who knew how long. Sometimes, Paul thought again, a missed lunch could change everything. And sometimes, that change was just the beginning. 2 weeks had passed since that day at McDonald's. Paul stood outside a cheerful yellow house in the suburbs, holding a wrapped package and feeling oddly nervous. The front yard had flowers growing in neat beds, and a bicycle leaned against the porch, signs of a real home. Ms. Parker had helped find this foster family for Tommy and his sister Sarah. The Hendersons had been fostering children for 15 years, and they specialized in helping kids who had been through trauma. They had no other children in their home right now, giving them plenty of time to focus on Tommy and Sarah's recovery. Paul rang the doorbell, hearing the sound of small feet running inside. The door opened to reveal Mrs. Henderson, a warm-faced woman in her 50s, and behind her, Paul's heart lifted, was Tommy, looking healthier than he had 2 weeks ago. "Mr. Paul," Tommy rushed forward, throwing his arms around Paul's leg in a hug. Paul noticed Tommy was wearing new clothes that actually fit him, and his hair had been neatly cut. "Hey, buddy, looking good," Paul said, grinning down at him. "Is it okay if I come in?" Mrs. Henderson smiled warmly. "Of course. Tommy's been so excited for your visit. He's been telling Sarah all about his friend, the giant." They walked into a bright living room filled with comfortable furniture and children's drawings on the walls. Some of the drawings showed a very large stick figure holding hands with 2 smaller ones. Paul could guess who those were supposed to be. Sarah was sitting on the couch, looking much better than she had in the hospital. The 7-year-old girl was still thin, but her eyes were bright and alert now. She smiled shyly at Paul. "Sarah, this is Mr. Paul. Tommy said proudly. "He's the one I told you about. He helped me save you." Paul knelt down carefully, trying to make his massive frame less intimidating. "It's nice to meet you, Sarah. Your brother is one of the bravest people I've ever met." Sarah nodded. "The doctors said I was very sick, but Tommy got help." She reached out and took her brother's hand. "He's my hero." Paul saw Tommy stand a little, straighter at those words. The serious look was still in his eyes, but now there was pride there too. "I brought something for both of you," Paul said, holding out the package. Tommy looked at Mrs. Henderson, who nodded that it was okay to take it. Together, the siblings unwrapped the gift to find 2 teddy bears wearing wrestling outfits, complete with tiny championship belts. "They're special bears," Paul explained, "like Officer Fuzzy, but these are wrestling bears. They help remind you that you're strong and brave and that you never have to fight alone." Tommy hugged his bear tight, while Sarah carefully traced the shiny belt on hers with her finger. "Would you like to see our room?" Tommy asked suddenly. "We have real beds, with blankets and everything." Paul looked at Mrs. Henderson, who nodded, her approval. He followed Tommy and Sarah up the stairs to a bedroom painted in cheerful blue. There were 2 beds with colorful quilts, a bookshelf full of books, and a nightlight shaped like a star. "Look!" Tommy pointed to a small table between the beds. "There sat Officer Fuzzy, keeping watch. He helps us sleep when we have bad dreams." "And Mrs. Henderson reads to us every night," Sarah added quietly. "Real books. We never had those before." Paul felt that familiar ache in his chest, but this time it was mixed with hope. These kids were healing, one day at a time. "Mr. Paul," Tommy said seriously, "Sarah didn't believe that you're really a wrestler. Can you show her your special move?" Paul laughed. "Well, I probably shouldn't do the knockout punch in the house, but how about we go to the backyard and I can show you both some safer moves?" The children's eyes lit up, and soon they were in the fenced backyard. Paul demonstrated some basic wrestling stances, helping them position their feet correctly. He showed them how to fall safely, using the soft grass as a mat. "Remember," he said, "wrestling moves are only for professionals in the ring. But being strong, that's something you can do anywhere." Mrs. Henderson watched from the back porch, smiling as she heard Tommy and Sarah laughing, maybe for the first time in years. As the afternoon went on, Paul saw more signs of healing. Tommy didn't flinch when unexpected noises came from next door. Sarah spoke up more, asking questions about wrestling and telling Paul about the books she was learning to read. When it was time to leave, both children hugged him tightly. "Will you come back?" Tommy asked. "You bet I will, buddy. And guess what? Next time, if it's okay with Mrs. Henderson, maybe we can all go to McDonald's together." Tommy's face lit up. "The one where we met?" "That's right. Maria asks about you every time I go in there." As Paul walked back to his car, he heard Tommy telling Sarah, "See? I told you he was real, and he's going to keep coming back." The trust in Tommy's voice made Paul more certain than ever about his decision to become an advocate for children like Tommy and Sarah. Sometimes the biggest changes started with the smallest voices, like a whisper in a McDonald's restaurant. 6 months had passed, and Paul stood backstage at an elementary school auditorium. Through the curtain, he could hear hundreds of young voices chattering with excitement. But it was one particular voice he was listening for. And now, Tommy's clear voice came through the microphone. "I want to introduce my friend. He's really big and really strong. But what makes him special is that he listens when kids need help. Please, welcome the Big Show." Paul walked out onto the stage, ducking slightly under the curtain rod. The children gasped and cheered, but his eyes went straight to Tommy, standing proudly at the podium in his new school uniform. Sarah sat in the front row with Mrs. Henderson, both of them beaming. This was the 10th school they'd visited as part of their new program. Speak up, stand tall. After what happened with Tommy and Sarah, Paul had worked with Child Protection Services to create a way to help other kids understand that it was okay to ask for help. "Thank you, Tommy," Paul said into the microphone. "You know, 6 months ago I was just trying to eat lunch at McDonald's. But sometimes the most important moments in life happen when you least expect them." The children listened intently as Paul told a careful version of Tommy's story about a brave boy who saw someone he thought could help and found the courage to speak up. "Now, I'm a pretty big guy," Paul continued, spreading his arms wide to demonstrate. The kids giggled as he pretended to barely fit on the stage. But being strong isn't just about being big. Tommy here is one of the strongest people I know, because he was brave enough to ask for help when he and his sister needed it. Tommy stood a little taller at those words. He was different now from the scared little boy in worn clothes. His eyes still held that serious look, but there was confidence there too. "Sometimes," Paul went on, "people who should take care of kids don't do a good job. Sometimes they hurt kids or make them feel scared. But there are lots of grown-ups who want to help. Teachers, police officers, doctors, and yes, even wrestlers." Ms. Parker stood at the back of the auditorium, watching the children's reactions. She had helped design the program to be age-appropriate while still getting the important message across. "We're going to play a game," Paul announced. "When I point to a grown-up helper in the room, I want you to tell me how they can help kids who are scared or in trouble." The children eagerly participated, pointing out how teachers could listen, how nurses could help sick kids feel better, how police officers could keep them safe. Each adult helper wore a special badge that read "Safe Person," something Tommy had helped design. After the presentation, children lined up to get autographs. But they weren't just asking for Paul's signature. Many of them wanted Tommy's too. He signed each paper carefully, taking his role as seriously as he took everything else. "Mr. Tommy," a small girl asked quietly, "were you really scared when you asked for help?" Tommy looked at her thoughtfully. "Yes, I was really scared. But being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do the right thing even when you are scared." Paul overheard this exchange and felt pride swell in his chest. Tommy wasn't just telling his story. He was becoming a leader, helping other kids understand they weren't alone. Later that afternoon, they sat in their favorite McDonald's, the one where it all began. Maria still worked there, and she always gave Tommy and Sarah extra cookies. Today, she had decorated their table with a small "Heroes Come in All Sizes" sign. "How many more schools are we going to visit?" Sarah asked, carefully dipping her French fry in ketchup. She had started joining them for some presentations, though she preferred to stay in the audience. "As many as want us to come," Paul answered. "The program is spreading to other cities too. Other wrestlers want to help, and police departments are training more officers like Officer Chen to work with kids." Tommy looked around the restaurant, his eyes stopping at the spot where he'd first gathered his courage to approach Paul. "Do you think we're helping other kids?" he asked seriously. "We already have, buddy," Paul said. "Remember the hotline numbers we give out at each school? Ms. Parker told me that calls have doubled since we started. That means more kids are asking for help when they need it." Sarah reached over and took her brother's hand. "You helped me," she said simply. "Now we're helping others." Paul watched the siblings share a look of understanding. They had been through so much, but instead of letting it break them, they were using their experience to make a difference. Through the window, Paul could see a billboard they'd helped design. It showed a child's drawing of various helpers, teachers, doctors, police officers, and yes, a very large wrestler, all standing ready to help. Above them were the words, "Your voice matters." "Ready for the next school tomorrow?" Paul asked. Finishing his burger, he finally got to eat a whole one here. Tommy nodded, then grinned. "Can you do the fake knockout punch again? The kids really liked that." "Only if you do your referee count," Paul laughed. As they finished their meal, other customers came and went, unaware that they were sharing space with real heroes. But that was okay. The biggest changes often started quietly, with a whisper, a helping hand, and the courage to stand tall. 1 year had passed since that fateful day at McDonald's. Paul stood backstage at the Children's Rights Awards ceremony, adjusting his tie nervously. He'd performed in front of thousands of wrestling fans, but tonight felt different. Tonight was about something bigger than entertainment. Tommy and Sarah sat in the front row with the Hendersons, who had officially adopted them 3 months ago. Both children wore their best clothes, and Tommy clutched a small envelope in his hands. He had asked to introduce Paul tonight, just as he had done at so many schools over the past year. The Speak Up, Stand Tall program had grown beyond anything they had imagined. Over 50 wrestlers had joined the cause, visiting schools across the country. The hotline numbers they distributed had helped hundreds of children find safety. Police departments had created special units trained to handle cases like Tommy and Sarah's, and Officer Chen had been promoted to lead one of them. "Ladies and gentlemen," the host announced, "please welcome Tommy Henderson, who has a special introduction for us." Tommy walked to the podium, standing on a small platform so he could reach the microphone. He looked out at the audience without fear. The serious little boy had grown into a confident 7-year-old who knew his voice mattered. "A year ago," Tommy began, "I was scared and hungry, and I didn't know who could help me. But I remembered seeing a really big wrestler on TV who always helped people who were in trouble, even when he was supposed to be the bad guy in the ring." The audience chuckled softly at this, and Paul felt his eyes getting wet. "I saw him at McDonald's that day, and even though I was really scared, I knew I had to be brave. Not just for me, but for my sister too. So I whispered something to him. Something I had never told anyone else." Tommy paused, looking down at his envelope. "Mr. Paul never told anyone what I whispered to him that day. He kept my secret until I was ready to tell it myself. And tonight, I'm ready." The room fell silent as Tommy opened the envelope with careful fingers. "What I whispered to him was, 'They hurt my sister every single day. And I'm afraid she's going to die if somebody doesn't help us.'" Paul heard several people in the audience gasp. He remembered how those words had hit him like a physical blow that day, how they had turned his world upside down. "Mr. Paul didn't just help us that day," Tommy continued. "He showed me that being strong isn't about how big you are or how many people you can beat in a wrestling ring. It's about using whatever strength you have to help others." Tommy turned to look at Paul backstage, giving him a small nod. "So please welcome my hero, my friend, and this year's recipient of the Children's Rights Advocate Award, Paul Big Show White." The audience rose to their feet as Paul walked onto the stage. He hugged Tommy gently, then stepped to the podium while Tommy returned to his seat beside Sarah. "Thank you, Tommy," Paul said, his voice thick with emotion. "You know, people often ask me why I gave up so much of my wrestling career to focus on this program. They ask if it was worth it, trading the roar of the crowd for school assemblies and meetings with social workers." He paused, looking at the 2 children in the front row. Healthy, happy, and safe. "The truth is, I didn't give up anything," I gained everything. That day in McDonald's, a little boy trusted me with his secret. And in doing so, he taught me what real strength looks like. It looks like a 5-year-old walking up to a stranger because his sister needed help. It looks like 2 children healing from their past by helping others build a better future. Paul held up the award, its crystal surface catching the light. This award isn't really for me. It's for every child who has found the courage to speak up. It's for every adult who has taken the time to listen. It's for every person who has looked at a situation that seemed hopeless and decided to do something about it. He turned to Tommy and Sarah. And it's especially for 2 young heroes who showed us that the smallest voices can make the biggest changes. After the ceremony, they gathered at their special McDonald's. Maria had decorated the whole restaurant this time with balloons and a congratulations banner. She had even gotten permission to name a booth the Hero's Corner, with a small plaque telling Tommy and Sarah's story. As they sat eating their celebration meal, Paul watched Tommy and Sarah sharing their fries with Officer Fuzzy and their wrestling bears. The serious look in Tommy's eyes was still there, but now it was the seriousness of someone who knew their purpose in life. "Mr. Paul," Tommy said suddenly, "remember when you asked me if I wanted chicken nuggets that first day?" Paul nodded. "Of course, buddy." That was the first time a grown-up had offered me food in a long time. That's when I knew I had picked the right person to tell. Sarah reached over and stole one of her brother's fries, something she never would have dared do a year ago. "You picked right," she said simply. Paul looked around the restaurant, at the families eating and children playing, just like that day a year ago. But now he saw each child differently, as someone who might need help, or who might be the one brave enough to help others. The award sat in the middle of their table, next to the ketchup packets and salt shakers. But the real prize was sitting right here in this booth. 2 children who had found their voices, their strength, and their place in the world. Tommy's whispered secret had changed everything. But it wasn't just the words he had said. It was the trust behind them. The belief that someone would listen, would care, would help. And in that moment, watching Tommy and Sarah laugh over their McDonald's meal, Paul knew that some secrets, once spoken, could change not just one life, but countless others. All it took was the courage to whisper, and someone willing to listen. Before you go, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop a comment below and tell me what city or country you call home. If this story touched your heart, remember to hit that like button. It really helps others find these important stories too. Did Tommy and Big Show's story resonate with you? Maybe you know someone who showed similar courage, or perhaps you're that person who chose to listen when someone needed help. Share your thoughts in the comments below. And remember, like Tommy taught us, sometimes the bravest thing we can do is speak up. And sometimes the most important thing we can do is listen. Thank you for being here, and I'll see you in the next story.